Hello and welcome back, guys. We're now starting a new story, one of many, by whiteleviathan. You can find author's profile link in the description. Let's begin Chapter 1, Prologue. Before the fire, Izuku felt like a deer in headlights as he felt the rain pelt his form. Wearing nothing more than black cotton joggers and a raincoat with the hood up, his fingers twitched and his legs almost quivered, but most of all, he couldn't believe himself. There, only a few hundred feet away from him down the street, was something he vowed to avoid looking at or being near for the last year. Something that dug into his gut like a hot knife through butter. He'd been careful up till now, but today he'd been in too much of a hurry. There was so much to do. So much work that required him to be in more than a performing shape. Now he wished he had been more attentive and not so lost in his head. This is awesome. I can't believe I qualified for the entrance exams. Be attentive, young man. My name's Mirio. The small crowd's words reached his ears easily. He watched, with bated breath, as a crowd of potential students in regular clothing descended upon the walls of a school that he once revered with all his heart and soul. They all looked hopeful, excited, and just dripping with eagerness. Their parents even more so. As he watched them enter with their umbrellas, their spirits completely unaffected by the weather as their parents waved them in, Izuku felt the glare forming on his face. Everything they had, everything they wanted, was right on the other side of that gate. It was like a portal to a new life, but it was beyond his reach despite it being right there with a flash of thunder, and as the kids continued to enter, he clenched his fists as a festering and familiar anger took hold of him. An anger that has been gnawing at his very being ever since then. Only a year and a half ago, he would have watched gleefully like he sometimes did as a child, but not today. Never again. The sidewalk was clear of people where he was, and the curbs and street were free of cars as well. So, he should have heard the small steps, but the rain and his thoughts were more than enough to distract him. Are you here for the UE entrance exams, young man? Izuku's eyes snapped to his left only to see nothing, but as he looked down, he chilled at the sight of a small creature. It wasn't particularly imposing, or at all really, but the stoat was easily recognizable to Izuku's eyes. He had long since memorized the names of Yui staff. Nizu was wearing a nice three-piece suit and a gray overcoat that matched his white fur nicely. While the scar across his one eye was more than observable through the clear umbrella, his minute expressions were blurred by the distortion of the water. The stoat's black eyes clearly meet his own. You seem rather drenched, young man, Nizu said in an inquisitive tone. Izuku could feel the glare on his face as his anger spiked, but he did not care to hide it. How could he? Principal Nizu of Yui High was standing right next to him, a figurehead of successful hero education, and as he looked at the creature, one so large in the world, he couldn't help but realize how small Nizu actually was. If he'd only seen him in person before, then maybe he'd have bowed in front of the creature that barely reached his stomach in height and begged the stoat to let him into Yui. However, Izuku could feel a dark urge inside him, but he pulled against it, if only for the fact that Yui's security extended beyond the walls. There was another crack and flash of thunder and lightning, and many of the parents told their kids to hurry up as the two stared at one another. Looking away from the stoat and back at the crowd of dwindling, but running students, one last time, he let out a deep sigh of resignation and shook his head. Izuku took a step back and twisted around and away from the crowd. Young man, the stoat asked again, though more urgently. Izuku took several steps away and was content with leaving him and this day behind. Do I need to call the police, or are you going to answer my question, young man? Izuku stopped in his tracks and swore internally. The pitter-patter of the rain not dampening the sudden sense of danger in the air. For a split second, he contemplated running, but this was Nizu. He wouldn't get far, even if he had a head start, so he simply answered his question. No. I simply lost track of where I was. The stoat didn't respond, but he did hear the soft splashes of feet in water getting closer to him. A flash of panic went through his system, but he got a hold of himself before he felt Nedzu's paw lift up his right breathe leg. If Nizu wasn't who he was, and in any other place, he would have kicked the little SHT across the street, but he didn't dare. Especially as he felt the stout poke his ankle monitor. This is a restricted area, young man. How did you? Do you see it beeping? He couldn't stop himself from asking. If you're trying to hide it, I suggest wearing baggier pants. Nizu said critically as he let go of his brief leg, the laws for juveniles and adults are the same, young man. The judge made an exception, Izuku said simply, lightly grating his teeth. An exception, HM. Nizu said with a hint of disbelief as he moved around and then stood in front of Izuku, blocking his path. Izuku looked down at the principal, whose eyes were peeking out from behind the umbrella with an intensity and focus he'd never seen before. His usual neutral face that the public knows well, being replaced by what he saw now. He would have recoiled at such a look from such an important person in the past, but bad looks from such people stopped affecting Izuku a long time ago. I take the safety of my students very seriously, young man, he said as he brought up his wrist and tapped his watch. There was a shrill but short alarm from inside the school, and in moments, he heard the gates behind him start to close. The sound of metal and steam permeated between the two of them, and as he heard the confused sounds of the parents behind them, Izuku recoiled back and almost fell over when a heavy and towering figure, from out of the air above, landed behind the principal with a resounding and heavy crack on the sidewalk. Cementos. Izuku's eyes widened in fear as the cement hero leveled him with an open look of disdain, like he was some sort of villain, and started raising his hands. The beginnings of his famous stone pillars rose out of the ground making Izuku sputter and take a step back as they angled towards him. W8. He yelled quickly as he held his arms out to his sides, my name is Midoriya Izuku. Izuku hoped dropping his name would be enough, and thankfully, the second he did he watched as Cementos and his pillars, of which were only a few feet away from connecting, froze in place. In the next moment, Nedzu's intensity almost completely vanished and morphed into surprise. It was quiet between them for several seconds, but as Cementos seemed to stand down and retract his pillars back into the ground, Izuku was able to let out a shaky breath of relief as he leaned forward and almost teared up as he looked at the ground. They recognized him, thank God, but for a moment, he imagined what getting hit by those pillars would have felt like, and he couldn't stop his body from shivering in fright or letting out a stress-filled whine. That fright, something he was so terribly familiar with, shot 1,000 little memories through his mind of the last year, of everything, but he shook it off the best he could, while also trying to suppress a growing nauseousness in his core. Why can't you just leave me alone? I didn't even, Izuku mumbled out weakly, almost as if he was crying, as he rubbed his eyes with his now shaking hands. They both looked shocked, especially Cementos, and Izuku didn't bother to wait for them to respond before he dug into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Fumbling with it, he pulled out his ID. He walked a few shaky steps towards the heroes and crouched down in front of the little stoat. He held up his prison ID, and with whatever courage he had left, tried glaring at the stoat, though he looked more desperate than anything, as Izuku pulled his hood back so there could be no misidentification. Does this explain it, stoat? Surprisingly, the stoat seemed lost for words as he looked at the shaking boy, but the principal of Yui quickly tapped his watch again as a different, more pleasant sound echoed from inside the school grounds. It does, young Midoriya, the principal said plainly. Izuku stared at him for a moment longer, before standing back up and trying his best to put his ID and wallet away. Then unless you're arresting me, or detaining me, please get out of my way. Chapter 2, Prologue, stirs the pot. Izuku's arm and fists ached. It was like they were pulsing, but it wasn't a bad pulse. It was the ache of progress and growth, and as he slowly undid the boxing wraps around his hands, his eyes landed on the other people in the gym. There were probably a dozen people in here, and the thud of mats and the grunts of intense focus helped him feel as if he blended in here. As he watched a new middle-aged blonde guy lay into a punching bag across the gym, making a fool out of himself with his bad form, even though it seemed he had an old man as a trainer, he felt satisfied with the progress he'd made over the last year. I don't get why we're here, Sensei. How much is a membership? Basic form is important, Yagi. You've been slacking for far too long. He undid the last loop around his finger and stuffed his cotton wraps into his small duffel bag. His normal clothes were in there as well, but after a long day, he didn't feel like changing back into them in the gym. And definitely not with a few newcomers here. The place was a well-furnished but small hole-in-the-wall in Mizutafu, and the owner didn't have a problem with him. He even encouraged him to come and train with him and the other quirkless individuals he let in. This place was a little haven, and it was one of the few places that made him feel strong and confident despite everything. The bags themselves were a therapeutic godsend, and he thanked whatever god may be out there that he was able to convince his mother and his parole officer to let him come here without issue. He was still allowed to defend himself at least, and unleashing his rage and anxiety felt too good. Pulling out his phone from his duffel bag, he frowned as he saw a message pop up on the screen. A message from his mother, 21 minutes ago. Inko, are you at the gym? It's 9 p.m. Izuku. Glaring slightly at his phone, he typed back. Izuku, just finishing up, I'll be home soon. As he stared at his phone and her familiar message, he huffed in annoyance before throwing his phone back into his duffel bag. Every time he went out, any time he went anywhere, her DMN messages always followed him. When are you coming home? It's getting late, come home now Izuku, or so help me. He wished that she'd just trust him, especially after a year and a half, but after everything, could he blame her if she didn't? He arranged his duffel bag and slung it around his torso, but instead of getting up, that little question he just stupidly asked himself was suddenly shooting through his mind. Can I? Izuku may have lived in a personal hell for months before his sentencing. He may even have been stuck in a prison cell for 3 months at Abacus Juvenile Detention Facility. But his mother. She had to watch Japan lay into her son and crush every dream he's ever had. Through his booking, his arrangement, his courtroom appearances, and then the press and societal firestorm. She was at his side at every step and the press captured every public appearance. The world was too stressful for him to notice at the time, but as he watched the clips after his release, Inko looked like she was about to break down into the same state he was in at any point. If there was anything he wished he could change, it would be that, but what's done is done. He wished things could have gone back to the way things were between them, but that was just a hopeless dream. Things would never be the same, despite him being a forgetful mess when he first got to his mother's new apartment. She sat him down and explained her own ground rules for him from then on. No more journals. No more fantasies. No more heroes. After everything he went through, he happily agreed and was able to slink off into his new bare and hero-free room. He hid in there for weeks, and his memory of those times was still a little spotty. But after he finally started venturing out from his new room, Inko watched every move he made. She looked through his stuff, and wouldn't even let him go anywhere outside without her or someone else accompanying him, up until about 10 months ago. Going outside alone at night was a no-go legally until 6 months ago. Though back when he first got out, he didn't even want to leave the house unless it was absolutely necessary. She was stricter. Harsher. And despite saying she still loved him, he could tell it wasn't as clear-cut as that anymore. That thought alone cut him to the core more than anything, and he couldn't do anything to fix it. It was an insurmountable canyon, and Izuku had long since abandoned it after she outright refused to talk about it. Maybe one day they'd patch things over, but he had other things to worry about now. Blinking away the beginning of his tears and quickly shaking his head, he shuffled off the bench and stood up. Stretching his arms out and rolling his pulsing shoulders, he banished those dark familiar thoughts back into the recesses of his mind where they resided. He then quickly fished out his baggy black hoodie, slipped the thing on, and pulled up the hood around his head tightly. Zipping the duffel bag back up, he looked around the gym one last time, his eyes momentarily lingering on the blonde guy and his old man trainer, before making his way out. How are you going to teach when that kid has better form than you, Yagi? It's not like I've needed it for the last few years, no excuses. The newcomer's little exchange was cut off by the door closing behind him, and the cool February air greeted him. His mother, despite her understanding, didn't like that he enjoyed the cold nights. He could bundle up and hide in as many clothes as he wanted out here. It was something he could never do in the summer, or the daylight comfortably, and ever since his ordeal, he's detested the mere thought of attention. Sinking into his hoodie sounded absolutely wonderful to Izuku, but he had to wait till he got home. Just those few newcomers in the gym were enough to make him a little anxious. Closing his eyes and sking in a deep breath, he already felt a bit of his anxiety diminish in the back of his busy mind. Time to go home, he mumbled out into the air. The gym wasn't too far from his house, but despite the cold air and snow on the ground, he felt more than warm in his joggers and hoodie. He could feel the snow beneath his shoes as he walked, and as he passed street after street and took a few turns, his anxieties and fears finally started to fade. This allowed him to think about his plans for the future without hindrance, and Izuku couldn't help but let a smile spread across his face. Things were progressing. Slowly, mind you, but just fast enough to be acceptable despite his situation. He didn't think he'd ever give up boxing, but he'd have to focus on other things once the infernal ankle monitor was taken off in 6 months. The gym was perfect for hand-to-hand combat training, and the guys at the gym were more than willing to help him, but he needed to work on his urban evasion strategies, and he couldn't exactly do that with a DMN ankle monitor. So much needs to be done, Izuku mumbled out into the air. Midoriya Izuku, an old voice suddenly asked from behind. Izuku immediately stopped, his eyes widening in a momentary bout of terror before he focused himself and twisted around with narrowed eyes. He looked to be in his late 60s, maybe early 70s, and was small, wrinkly, and slightly hunched over. His hair and beard were completely gray, and in his fancy but functional tweed suit and heavy jacket, he didn't seem like much of a threat on the surface. Izuku's eyes lit up with recognition and a bit of confusion as he realized who it was. It was that newcomer from the gym. Specifically, the old man who was coaching the blonde guy. He looked at his hand next, and Izuku nearly paled as he noticed something in the old man's hand. It was a red notepad. His red notepad. The title on the front of it read, "To-do list." "This fell out of your bag," he said in a flat tone. Izuku's eyes narrowed on the notepad, and he took one step forward, fully intending to rip it from the old man's hands. But before he got another step the old man suddenly tossed it to him. He caught it out of the air and quickly looked it over. Flipping through it, he could see that none of the pages seemed to be missing, but he could have looked through it for all Izuku knew. Izuku quickly stuffed his notepad back into his duffel bag as he leveled the old man with a look of suspicion. The old man, in return, looked at him with annoyance. "I didn't read through it if that's what you're giving me that look for, brat," he said in an almost offended voice. As Izuku stared at the man, he noticed his disposition. He seemed to be holding himself strangely. He may be older and with a slight curve to his back, but he almost looked ready to move. He was coaching that blonde guy at the gym, specifically on how to box. A flash of déjà vu hit him, and he took a step back. Of the many times he's been confronted on the street by people who knew his name and recognized him, it's never been good. Being recognized by someone who knew how to fight. This wasn't good at all. "Thank you" would suffice, vigilante. Izuku almost recoiled at the word and gritted his teeth as he quickly turned around and away from the man as he readjusted his duffel bag on his shoulder. "You're not going at it again, are you, kid?" He was about to run, but that little question stopped him in his tracks. He'd heard that stupid question many times before as a form of mockery, but the old man actually sounded serious. Izuku wondered if reacted too harshly to the notepad, but it didn't matter now. No one who knew his name ever sounded serious when they were just being coy. He felt a phantom ache on the back of his head as he remembered the last time someone on the street noticed him. Never again. Izuku simply unzipped his bag and calmly rummaged through it until he found his knife, but he kept his hand in the bag itself. Turning around, he lightened his glare and kept his eyes focused on the old man. "Thanks, old man. Now, what is my business to you?" The old man's eyes were on his bag, and he looked to be standing just a bit straighter in the snow. "I'm not looking to hurt you, kid," the old man said as he held his hands up in front of him. "Then walk away and leave me alone," Izuku said simply. "I saw what the commission did to you, kid," he said in a somewhat softer tone. "I don't want to have to see it again. So, tell me, are you at it again? Was this guy just trying to PSS him off?" "What a ridiculous question." "What? You see a kid punching a bag and think, gee, this guy must be a criminal." Izuku said thinly. "I know what drive is when I see it, brat." "Drive? Who is this guy?" Izuku wanted to run off. But with the way the old man held himself, Izuku didn't dare turn his back on this guy again. Izuku tried perceiving anything else about this old man, something that could indicate a quirk, but he just seemed normal on the outside. He didn't recognize the man at all, and he didn't look like any currently active heroes. Why couldn't it just be easy? That trial was a travesty, kid, and I doubt they'll be even any more forgiving the second time. For a moment, Izuku's glare dropped, and he actually seemed surprised by his words. Sympathy. It was such a rare thing and almost like a piece of straw in a needle stack, but he wasn't about to let his guard down so easily. Though if he was looking for assurances, he could offer the prodding old man that much. Maybe he'll go away. Reaching down to his brief leg, he pulled it up and revealed the slim ankle monitor around his ankle. The little green light blinked and illuminated the snow near his feet. "Can't exactly be a vigilante with this on me, now, can I?" The old man seemed to visually relax at the sight of it, though Izuku kept his other hand on his knife regardless. "Then why train?" the old man asked. It was such a simple question, and in that moment, it was what like everything in his mind was at its door wanting to spill out. The old Izuku used to be so open and honest with everyone, and in a morbid sense, it almost seemed like it would be a good idea to get a second opinion. But then he'd have to resort to drastic measures. "So that no BSTRD can ever break my arm, or my life, ever again," Izuku said sternly, though truthfully. The old man took in Izuku's measure for what seemed like a minute before he smirked and nodded at him. "Despite what the world may tell you, you did something noble, kid." A heavy gust of wind blew down the street, and a shiver went through the old man's frame. "Just don't do anything stupid when you finally get that thing off." Izuku simply nodded back, "I'll try not to." A very sudden cold breeze shot through the street as a light shower of snow from a nearby roof blew into the old man at full force like a wave. Izuku had to hold back a chuckle as the old man grumbled angrily at the weather and quickly puffed out his coat collar and stuffed his hands in his pockets. "I don't get how you kids can dress so light," he grumbled as he turned to his side. "Call it good BLD flow," Izuku couldn't help but joke back. The old man simply waved his hand dismissively at the boy as he shook his head. Finally turning around and walking away. Izuku kept his eyes on the man as his little waddling steps carried him further and further away. He finally disappeared around a turn, and with it, the tension in Izuku's shoulders. Izuku waited several minutes in his spot before he even thought of letting go of his knife. Looking for any sign of anything, but there was nothing. Just more wind and blowing snow. Pulling his hand from his duffel bag and zipping it back up after a few deep and smoky breaths in the cold air, Izuku couldn't help but feel like he just narrowly avoided a car crash. Pressing his hand on his duffel bag and touching the notepad inside, he felt absolutely stupid. Even more so when he also noticed his vibrating phone. "DMN idiot," he said to himself with a stress-filled groan, of all the things to drop. Chapter 3, Prologue. Of hope and resentment there were 1,000 things he could be doing, studying, practicing, or just outright being lazy. But this was something he couldn't help but cherish. The freedom of it. The joy in it. It was like a high he hadn't felt in years. Running. Actually running. The streets, the rooftops, and the deadly catwalk he played as he danced the two of them like a little devil in the night. His ankle was free, and now he couldn't feel more alive. He couldn't stop himself from hollering as he jumped across the gap and felt weightless for all but a glorious second as he landed on the opposite roof and rolled forward before spinning up to his feet. He could feel the summer breeze through his hair, and he rushed forward with another laugh. It was like the energy in the last 2 years was bleeding out of his system, and as he ran past the neon signs and dark corners, he couldn't feel more at home. He started a bit before sunset, but he ran for miles upon miles, and now the night sky was out and sparkling. His feet carried him from one side of Mizutofu to the next, and it was liberating, but sadly, even he couldn't last forever. Spotting a high enough building in the skyline, he looked at it like a mountain. He rushed to it through the streets before he started ascending it in a mad dash. His legs and arms were burning, but he refused to falter, and as he descended the last 10 feet, he crawled over the edge and rolled out onto the roof. A triumphant laugh exited his mouth like a wave as he looked up at the stars. "I'm free," he yelled up at the stars, an intensity filling him as he screamed out one last time, "I'm finally free." A very brief spell of dizziness hit him as the last of his air left his lungs, and he let himself fall back completely onto the concert roof. A pleased smile on his face as he breathed in and out. His heart and body were pulsing, and for the first time in a long time, he felt spent. Not tired, not exhausted, and not pent up. He didn't know how long he was up there, but he simply laid there and stewed in his elation. There was the echo of the city, but up here it may as well be silent to his ears. He laid there for a while, soaking up the stars and letting his beating heart and aching limbs lessen, but the dopamine rush that was the day was just too much to let him truly calm down. He felt the faint giddiness permeate his body, and despite the flapping of heavy wings in his ears, he didn't care to let it bother him. "Wait a minute," Izuku muttered to himself. The flaps got louder. Looking around the sky above him, he didn't see anything, but he heard another big flap of wings behind him. Lower, and not too far away. They didn't sound like the wings of some small creature, but something much bigger. Slowly twisting his body around on the concrete so he was on his chest, he bear-crawled quietly to the edge of the roof towards the sounds of flapping wings. "Man, I'm beat, getting back home is going to take a bit longer than I thought," a cool voice said on the other side. Izuku raised a brow of curiosity at the voice. Of which was a young male and a bit familiar, but for some reason, he couldn't quite place it. He couldn't quite tell if it was a younger hero or just one of the guys he watches on the internet. However, they were using their quirk in public, and that either meant a hero or a delinquent like himself. Izuku held back a chuckle at the thought of sneaking up on someone all the way up here, so he couldn't hold back the Cheshire grin spreading across his lips. Slowly scrunching up against the edge and peeking his head up, he watched with wide eyes at the sight of a hero he'd never thought he'd see up close. Hawks, the number 11 hero in Japan with his iconic flight jacket and red wings, was only one level down from him. The famous bird landed on the roof below him with tucked wings, and he seemed to be carrying a lunchbox at his hip as he leaned down and sat down on the ledge. He looked laid back and relaxed, and as he opened his box, he rummaged through it and seemingly pulled out 2 wrapped sandwiches. A course of nerves and rage went through his system as he stared the hero down. Out of a slight sense of paranoia, he looked around and behind him for any sign of any of the hero's flying feathers, but in the darkness, he wasn't able to see much. "I shouldn't have skipped lunch," Hawks bemoaned as he started devouring his first sandwich. Izuku watched the hero silently and with a slowly growing sense of bewilderment. Did the hero not see him? Those wings were legendary in the hero industry and were adept at detecting things Hawks couldn't possibly see with his own 2 eyes. Was he not paying attention? Was he just acting? Those speculations flew through his head, but his Cheshire grin stayed right in his place as he slowly stood up all the way. The hero rummaged through his pocket, and he then pulled out his phone. The hero's eyes were glued to it before it started to play some sort of American rock music. Izuku watched as he placed the phone down on the ledge at his side before he went back to eating, his head bobbing back and forth to the music. Could he? Izuku stepped onto the edge and out onto the top of the stairwell that had a ramp conveniently leading down right behind the hero. Izuku carefully pulled his phone from his pocket and opened it. He first snapped a picture of the hero, which admittedly worked well with the backdrop of the city. before silently searching for a video as he hatched up a little plan. Being unnoticed opened up so many opportunities, and the dark little thoughts that ran through his mind were endless, but he was no match for a hero of his caliber. His quirk was too strong, his fighting skills too significant, and he didn't even bring his pocketknife with him today. The wind blew across his exposed arms, legs, and face, and those ideas seemed even stupider. Heroes took everything from him, but he'd have to wait for another day. He tapped on a video and paused it. His eyes watched the hero's every head bob to the beat of his song. Still seemingly oblivious to the boy behind him. Sneaking up behind him and playing "Screaming Goat" in his ear could do the trick. Right. His Cheshire grin only felt more right as he lowered his screen's brightness and carefully descended the ramp. "I let you cut me open, just to watch me bleed," the bird seemingly sang in English. His English wasn't perfect, but as he went another few feet, it didn't matter. "Gave up who I am for who you wanted me to be," he continued. He was only 10 feet behind him now, and the tension in his body only grew as the hero still seemed none the wiser. His heart beating in his ears. "Don't know why I'm hoping, so effing naive." Fallon, for the promise of the emptiness machine, he belted out, getting more into it as Izuku raised the phone just behind the hero's ear. The emptiness mock dash, the phone played out at full volume. "Ah!" the hero screamed out in utter surprise, the winged hero recoiling forward and down over the edge like a flailing chicken. Izuku couldn't hold back the laughs as the hero disappeared from view below the ledge, the tension in his body disappearing as he took a few steps back before falling back onto the ground into a fit of laughter. He immediately saw a few dozen feathers surround him in a half-oval around his body, but he couldn't stop laughing. He couldn't actually believe he got so close, and for a minute, he just let himself break down. "Laugh it up, kid," Hawks grumbled out, the hero landing at his feet. Izuku peeked up at the man, and while he seemed to look serious now, he just saw him flail off the side of a building. "I got you," Izuku sang out, another series of giggles exiting his mouth. The hero stared at the boy for a few moments with a look of disapproval, but the look melted in the face of Izuku's laughter. The hero eventually smirked as he waved his hand dismissively. Yeah, the hero chuckled before he turned around and walked back to his ledge. "You got lucky, kid." Most of the feathers around Izuku slowly flew back into the hero's wings, but Izuku saw a few glints in the moonlight flying around above them. Izuku got the last of his chuckles out before he stood back, a feeling of accomplishment permeating through him. He'd been practicing his movement all day, and while he did sneak up on the hero when their guard was down, he felt more than satisfied with the day. Hawks was leaning against the edge, his wings now partially extended, as he started going at his second sandwich. Izuku had gotten this far, so in a fit of boldness, he decided to walk up next to the hero and leaned against the ledge as well. He noticed how the hero stuffed his phone back into his pocket. The music no longer played in the night as the hero ate a little faster. "Sorry if I scared you there," Izuku said cheekily, not meaning it at all. "Sure, kid," the hero said in an incredulous tone, "what are you doing up here anyway?" "I climbed up here first, Hawks, so technically you're on my roof." "Your roof," the hero said as he fully looked at Izuku with a smirk and a raised brow, "aren't you trespassing?" "Not at all," Izuku said with a smile as he glanced over at the man. If that look was anything to go by, Hawks didn't believe him at all. "So," the man just shook his head and took a big bite out of his sandwich as Izuku chuckled again. "So," he gulped down his bite, "what's the infamous vigilante of Mizutafu doing out tonight?" A pang of paranoia shot through him, and for the first time in the day, his smile fell. Why do they always recognize him? Izuku shifted in his spot, and he leaned harder into the concrete ledge, focusing on the skyline of the city in front of him, as he did his best to clamp down on that familiar anger that bubbled dangerously in his mind. Forcing his smile back, he looked over at the observing hero, celebrating. "Birthday," the hero absently asked as he went back to looking out over the city. Nah, Izuku didn't bother to try and lie, the hero could just look up the news later anyway. Freedom. Haven't you been out for a bit now? Hawks asked inquisitively. Yeah, but my parole finished up last week, and now I no longer need to wear that DMN ankle monitor, Izuku said as a bit of true relief showed in his voice. No more meetings, no more checkups, and no more commission watching my every step. Hawks didn't respond for a moment as he finished up his sandwich, his eyes glancing at the green-haired boy as he crumpled up the wrapper. DMN. Not going to lie, kid, that sounds pretty nice, the hero said as he threw the wrapper in his lunchbox, a tiny bit of discernible jealousy in his voice. After 2 years of constant monitoring, it is, Izuku sked in a deep breath through his nose, it's a burden I no longer have to bear. The muffled sounds of the city below echo around them. Now I can run and climb anywhere I want. Izuku glanced over at the man and lowered his voice in a mock accusatory tone, unless you're spying on me for them. This actually caused the hero to laugh. The hero bellowed over for a moment as Izuku chuckled along with him. If I were spying on you, Midoriya, you wouldn't have noticed, he said as he held a finger up, or been able to sneak up on me. Maybe you're just rusty, Izuku wondered aloud. I may be a new hero, but I'm not that green, the hero said with a chuckle as he lightly punched Izuku's shoulder. Hawk started to zip up his lunchbox and sling the seemingly large strap around his wings and across his torso. He had a smile on his face, but Izuku could tell he was about to leave. The man took one step back, but out of impulse, he reached out and grabbed the man's wrist in a vice grip. Hawk's eyes narrowed instantly, and his cool smile became a thin line. Wait, Izuku asked quickly, trying to sound desperate, can I ask you a question before you go? Please. Hawk seemingly took his measure again, but after a moment, he simply shrugged and started smiling again. I don't see why not. I will ask you to let go of my wrist, though. Oh, sorry, Izuku said nervously as he quickly let go, his face reddening a bit. No worries, shoot. Izuku twisted around and leaned back against the ledge, thinking for a moment on how to word his question, and decided to be simple with it. Besides, Izuku didn't think he could reliably get this information from anywhere else. Might as well try the direct approach. Well, given you're the number 11 hero in Japan, I assume you know a lot of current heroes, Izuku started. Definitely, and let me tell you, kid, they're all uptight. Izuku looked at the smiling hero flatly, the plainly obvious info almost sounding ridiculous coming from him. I was wondering how well known I still am among heroes, Izuku asked simply. The hero's smile dropped again, a more critical look adorning his features as his eyes bore into mine. What are you asking me, Midoriya? What do you mean? What kind of person asks if heroes know about them? It's not. A pang of frustration hit him at his subtle allegation, but Izuku charged on anyway. All I ever wanted to be was a hero, but the world just put me in a box, Izuku said with frustration as he glared down at the hero's feet. Now some hero every other month rubs it in my face. Even you. Izuku sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I just want to know if that's going to end anytime soon. Hawks didn't reply at first, but he hummed in what sounded like understanding. That's it, huh? I'd probably want to be forgotten too if I were in your position, Hawk said lightly, almost with compassion. Yeah. Well, do you think I called you infamous for no reason at all, Midoriya? Well, no dash, I was only a hero for a year, but you were the first major controversy I lived through. A quirkless vigilante. No one thought such an individual would be a child, let alone in a leaked video of one with their face down in the pavement as a hero shattered their arm, Hawk said simply. Izuku shifted uncomfortably, that very simple description almost stinging and making him unable to look up at the man as that day flashed through his memory like a bad joke. It may have been 2.5 years since you got arrested, but everyone noticed you then, Midoriya, said in an almost apologetic tone. Izuku crossed his arms and kept his rapidly growing glare at the hero's feet, internally swearing at the world, though suddenly the hero stepped forward, and he felt Hawk's hands on his shoulder. Izuku's head snapped up, his glare still there as he stared at a face full of sympathy. It's going to be a few more years, kid. Keep your head up, and don't let a bunch of assholes win, he said with a nod. I just wish things were different. A lot of us do, Midoriya, the hero said sympathetically as he nodded pointedly at Izuku. You may have been caught, but all any of us can do is move forward. Izuku just stared at him for a moment, unable to think of anything new to say to such a familiar and ridiculous statement, so he simply nodded back. The hero smiled and dropped his arm as he took a few steps back. He saluted Izuku, and in one moment, he extended his wings, a few dozen feathers shooting into them, and in the next, he shot up into the air with a powerful slide of his wings. Izuku watched silently as hawks flew north towards Tokyo. Keeping his eyes on the hero until his red wings disappeared in the dark sky miles away. The wind ruffled Izuku's hair as he stood at his spot for a little while, staring off into the distance as the last thing Hawk said reverberated through his head. What had he been thinking? Of course, everyone would still notice him and make things more complicated, but Hawk's last words. A lot of us do. Was just, objectively wrong. Sliding down the ledge behind him, he let out a frustrated sigh as he landed on his butt and leaned his head back against the ledge. A lot of you feel that way, huh? He said up into the sky in total disbelief. Where were you then? Neither he, his mom, nor his lawyer were contacted by a supportive hero during it all. All he saw was a flood of condemnation and belittlement, and it had long since stopped stinging. Were you hiding, Hawks? You little coward, he mumbled out. If the BSTRDS actually cared, maybe they would have at least posted something online, but even as he scoured his brain, he couldn't remember anything of the sort. Izuku clenched his fists in his lap, his anger only growing as he was once again reminded of it all, of how society broke him. He wasn't going to believe in their hollow sympathies after all the work he's put in. You heroes had your chance. Reaching towards his pocket and unzipping it, he pulled out a phone-sized bag and looked at it. Beneath the fabric was a small Faraday cage, and inside it was a burner phone. He had been holding off on using it, especially given he just wanted to enjoy his first week of freedom worry-free, but he needed to get things rolling soon. So why not now, while the fire is hot? Opening the bag and pulling it out, he turned it on and dialed a number for a call he'd been meaning to make for almost a year at this point. It only rang a few times. This is the Humorize Japanese branch. How may I help you today? Asked a serious-sounding female, though he just knew her as Emily. Hey Emily, it's me, Midoriya Izuku. He heard the thrashing of papers through the line, and the sound of something heavy fell over. How are you, darling? I saw the news earlier this week and I've just been dying to reach you. You saw, huh? Not just me, but your tutors as well, she said enthusiastically. Izuku's sweat dropped. Tell Takashi and others I apologize. No need to worry, Izuku. In fact, if you haven't gotten their emails, they asked me to tell you that all your homework and classes are cancelled for another week. Izuku's eyes widened in complete and utter disbelief. No way. Emily giggled on the other end. Yes way. His tutors were as no-nonsense as it gets. Couple that with his mom, and they were hawks when it came to his education. Sometimes it was overbearing, but Humorize was all he and his mother had to turn to, so she was on him and even participated sometimes when it mattered. Thanks to them, he was well on his way to graduating early. Thanks, Em, he said fondly, a rare warmth spreading through his chest. Emily was maybe 10 years older than him, quirkless too, and has been his point of contact with Humorize since the start. She was kind, helpful, and had a big heart once you got to know her. Even if she did at times get intense about Humorize and its mission. Though that was just all of them. We all want you to enjoy yourself, Izuku, run as much as you want, she said with pride in her voice. Oh, I am, Izuku said with a wide smile. But I was actually calling for something else. I noticed it wasn't your usual number. What do you need? Humanity's salvation, he said simply. Those words felt heavy on his tongue. Words he had once been too afraid to even contemplate. Are you? She was quiet for a moment before he was forced to hold the phone a bit from his ear as Emily started squealing in delight. I'll put you right through, Izuku. We'll talk later. Izuku stared up at the starry sky as he listened to the hold music. The weight of the phone in his hand only grew by the second as he contemplated what he was about to do. The music was pleasant, but like many things, there were better options out there to choose from. Some were dark, others more harmonious, but this was all he had. This was his only route. Izuku stilled as the music stopped, a soft click of a man picking up the phone coming through the speaker. How nice of you to call, Midoriya Izuku. Izuku took a silent breath as he brought his head down and leaned forward, bringing up his knees as he stared intently at the floor as he rested his arms on his knees. Squashing the last of his doubts as he clenched his fists, almost desperately, as if he was trying to hold on to something. There's no going back now. I'd like to take you up on your offer, Flecked. Chapter 4, A New Day. A shared story. Amongst the skies of Japan and the wind at his back, a hulking form barreled through the air as if there was no resistance. The streak of red, the flash of blue, and the wave of golden hair in the evening sun were known to all who could see it. A man above all. A man who smiles in the face of villainy. A man who won't back down. All Might. The city beneath him was alive, and as the people went about their lives, they were none the wiser of what passed above them. All Might towered over most men, but even up here in the sky, where most things seemed small, if any did see him, he may as well have shone as brightly as the setting sun. He hoped that anyone who looked up in the air and saw him saw hope itself, and that it would be enough to brighten their day. Or if they were of the villainous sort, that they saw a being of just cause that spread fear and loathing into the hearts of all those who sought to harm peaceable people. All Might hoped it was the former, but even with all his work, there would always be those who needed reminding. As he surveyed the cityscape from above, he saw no villains to quash this night. Or rampages to end. It was quiet and peaceful, and that's what All Might loved most. The nation, despite its state many decades ago in his youth, finally had the ability to pursue a happy life without unjust interference. That most could live in a nation without villains lording over the avenues of prosperity. That's what he sought to provide to this nation, and after so many hard-fought years, he's never been prouder of himself and those who have helped him along the way. Because up here in the air, despite flying through the sky day after day, he has never felt so light. Taking a deep breath as he felt gravity pull him back to earth, he couldn't help but laugh out loud as he plummeted past the clouds. Eventually, tucking and rolling into the green grass of a park. Standing back up proudly, and with only a foot-sized patch of exposed dirt to mark his presence, he looked over the peaceful city from the earthen hill. The park he was in was only occupied by birds and squirrels, but the city outside of it was more than alive. His patrol route was finished for the day, and as he looked over the rapidly oranging skies and the twinkling of city lights starting to turn on, he couldn't help but remember what it used to be like. The mental images of toppled skyscrapers and smoky fires still haunted him to this day, but it was gone in a few blinks. In its place, a healthy and vibrant metropolis he'd be proud to call his home. Even if he didn't know its name offhand. The city was a pleasant contrast, to be sure, but even as he stood here, he still wasn't used to it. Sometimes he couldn't even believe that the nation had improved, even though he'd done the work with his own 2 hands. For decades, he fought the forces of evil and decay, and nowadays, it felt as if few things truly required his attention at all. A lost cat or a downtrodden mugger barely constituted a truly pressing issue. Compared to now, his early working years were a violent mess. Villains were explosive, and the fights even more so. Both in Japan and in America. Though, in those years, villain was a light word. Monsters ruled with bloody fists and murderous intentions, and all that most could do was take small bites out of gargantuan problems. Problems that oftentimes came right back in different and more efficient ways. It was a constant fight that took his parents' lives before he'd received one for all from his mentor. The power of one for all changed his life and finally enabled him to do more than just pick up rubble and casualties. to finally fight back. But his elation in his changed circumstances was short-lived. He had barely shot into the world of heroics with his fists and smile, and barely had any time to actualize his goals before his mentor's arch-nemesis appeared. There were many brutal villains in Japan, but the terror of all for one was just another serving of acid down his and Japan's throats. A terror that hunted him and took the lives of even more people. Of his mentor. His friends. And anyone who tried to stand in his way. It was a harrowing time, while ending in the victory of all that is good only a decade ago, left many scars in All Might's soul. He tried not to think about such dreadful things too much, but whenever he did, he didn't let the memory of terror rule him. He instead let those memories fuel him. He let them motivate him and used them to remind himself of what happens when heroes aren't around to save those who are still breathing. He vowed to become more than a hero. To be more than just a symbol of victory. For them. For the world. He vowed to become a symbol of peace. For you, MSTR, he said quietly to the empty park. A park growing beautifully in the setting Japanese sun. He wouldn't mind staying here in the grass, but even he needed sleep. His power wasn't that great. Ha ha ha, now I think that's enough for tonight. Squatting down, he clenched the muscles in his powerful legs and jumped into the air toward Tokyo with an uncompromising laugh. He could almost see the city's bright light pollution in the far distance. A light that sent an old and unneeded feeling of relief flowing through him. It's still there, he mumbled. Those words were an old reflex, and he didn't think he would ever be able to stop it, despite everything being all right in the land of the rising sun. His presence once again shines over all. The wind snapped at his face, the birds barreled out of the way, and as he left the city and looked over the approaching countryside, he felt a slight sting of pain in his hip. At first, he shrugged it off, but as he landed on an empty country road and jumped again, it returned. It wasn't bad or debilitating, but it was there nonetheless. He tried shrugging it off again, but as he landed and jumped again, he couldn't help but sigh in frustration as he let his mind wander to a conversation he had not too long ago with a dear friend. The whir of mechanical parts and computer fans was a constant noise in this room. No matter when Yagi stopped by, he was always invigorated by what he saw. New inventions, new advancements, and even the occasional presence of his goddaughter. It was always a pleasant time, but today it's a little less so. For the first time in a long time, when Yagi looked down at himself and shivered atop the cool metal table, he saw the countless wires and sensors attached to his powered-down body as if he were in a hospital. His heart rate, the state of his skeletal structure, his brain waves, and even the rate of his hair growth were all being collected. It was always strange, being in this position, but he figured it would happen again. Though not so soon. It had only been half a year since he'd been in this room on Island. And when did it start, Yagi? Yagi's eyes were drawn back to his friend, David Shield, and he was almost taken aback by his troubled look. About 4 months ago. What is it? David quickly went back to typing away at the computer as Yagi watched as several small holographic graphs appeared around him in quick succession. He looked from one to the next, his troubled look slowly morphing into one of silent fear that he'd seen in many throughout the years. It was never a good sign, and now it regarded him. David. He ignored the hero as he stood up from his chair and ran across the room. He looked frantic as he started typing away into a console attached to what looked like a large supercomputer. A tinge of worry spread in Yagi's spine as he watched his friend pull down a massive lever next to the console. The large computer seemed to finally turn with a loud electrical whir as the large screen on the wall at the head of the lab turned on and showed a buffering icon. David, he called out again, a little more urgently. I have to make sure, he responded in a drastic tone. Make sure of what? That your power isn't decreasing. Yagi would have burst out laughing right then and there, but the seriousness in his friend's tone was enough to silence his reaction. Losing his power. Him of all people. He had never heard of something so absurd. I just have some discomfort in my hip, David. You shouldn't have any discomfort at all, Yagi. Your quirk is basically perfect and now dash, the screen lit up with another graph. It showed a line high up on the chart going from left to right, and as Yagi traced it with his eyes, it went down only slightly. There were only about 43 points, and as he analyzed the graph, he realized every point was when he had been strapped to a table like this one. Thinking back, the first time he did it was nearly 30 years ago. Yagi looked to his friend, and he watched as the man let out what seemed to be the biggest sigh of relief he'd ever seen come out of him. Even going as far as to lean to his side against the machine. However, Yagi's eye returned to the graph. At the start of the graph, the dot was nearly at the top, and over the preceding dots, the dots slowly, and only slightly, descended. It only took him a moment to realize what he was looking at after he remembered David's initial worry. "Can you detect my quirk?" David looked a little facetious at first, but he simply nodded after a moment. "It's something I've been working on for a long while, Yagi. I was able to isolate and extrapolate a reliable set of bio readings, and I've even been able to recreate it with a few others as well." Yagi almost couldn't believe it. "That's remarkable." David returned to his original console and sat back down in his nice office chair. Typing away at it, and laying Yagi with a few more inquisitive looks, his relief slowly morphed back into a more mild concern that still left Yagi with questions. "Despite your quirk holding strong, Yagi, it seems we discovered something else." "What is it?" "Your quirk is not as perfect as we thought it was." All Might winced as he landed on a soggy patch of dirt and jumped once again through the air. The sun had set, but there was still some light in the sky. All Might preferred to travel by day for the sake of visibility, but he still had a while until he reached Tokyo. However, he didn't feel like going faster this night. He could feel every vibration in his hips, every ripple of his leg muscles as he reflexively rotated his leg mid-leap for some slight relief from the steadily increasing pain. He had to try and pace himself, but as he neared the approaching ground, a sharp pain spread from around his leg socket like a knife stabbing through his flesh. "DMN my old bones," All Might ground out through gritted teeth. He braced himself as he rapidly descended towards the ground, preparing to tuck and roll into what seemed like a particularly large bush in the dark. He was busy considering his form and how he could more easily avoid some more pain with the next impact when he noticed what appeared to be a child and a flickering light through the large bush, which now looked like a small tree. "Get down," he yelled in a hurry. The child seemed confused at first, but as he looked up, the boy seemed more than startled as he threw himself to the ground with his hands over his head. Twisting in the air, pain-bead med, All Might used his power and punched to the side. The force of the punch shot him in the direction opposite of the kid's jump at the last moment. However, All Might was barely able to contain a light yell of pain as he smashed through a rather large and healthy tree close by. He could hear the cracking and splitting of wood on his back and around him. The pointy splinters and chunks of wood assaulted his back and sides as he abruptly smashed into the dirt like a sack of rolling potatoes. He didn't roll far, but he could feel the pain in his leg socket flare in sharply as he unceremoniously stopped on top of it. Rolling the rest of the way over with only a slight hiss of contained pain, he didn't notice the rest of the tree falling on him until it was too late. The several-foot-wide tree firmly landed on his stomach and knocked him back down onto his back. The tree had the extra effect of knocking the air out of his lungs, and for the first time in a long time, he wheezed in his disorientation and pain. "All Might," he heard a voice vaguely yell out as his vision swirled for a moment, but he just focused on his breathing. It was dark all around him, and All Might could feel the tree on top of him and the chips in the dirt beneath him. He initially tried getting up, but a stinging pain in his leg socket stopped him again. Closing his eyes with gritted teeth, he forced the pain away from his mind and focused on keeping the weight of the tree trunk off his chest. "Are you all right? Are you okay?" The words were closer and a little echoey, but he used them as a temporary anchor. "All Might." His eyes snapped open to see the outline of a boy standing over his head with a flashlight aimed at his tree-covered torso. For a moment, he panicked and thought about his image and tried to force himself up, but the pain and slowly clearing vision quickly reminded him of the need for restraint. Pushing himself too hard at this point would just incur more injury, and the boy has already seen him be less than, well, invulnerable. There's no going back on that front. Looking at the boy and then around the immediate area, he could tell they were alone. If the light of his flashlight illuminated the area right, it seemed that he and the boy were actually in a small ditch by the seams of it. Maybe even a small gully. No sound of cars, no sound of trains, no sound of other people. The boy himself had green curly hair, green eyes, and he couldn't be younger than 16. He was wearing what looked like plain hiking pants and a baggy dark hoodie. He also had a small backpack slung over his arm that looked hastily opened. The boy didn't seem to have any injuries, and for that he was glad. Despite that, however, he was a little sour. Of all the places in the wide-open countryside, right where he was going to land, the boy was there. His rotten luck hadn't run out, it seemed, and now he'd have to talk to him. See if he could convince him to stay quiet about this little incident. But first, he had to get this tree off of himself. Even if his hip now burned in protest. "Do you need me to call Dash?" "No, no, I am quite all right, lad," All Might said simply with a confident smile. He was careful not to let the pain show in his tone. It was something he was quite good at after so many years. "Stand back, young lad," All Might said as he positioned his hands under the fallen trunk. The boy, who looked rather worried, scrambled away quickly, and with little effort, All Might rolled the thick trunk of the tree off of himself and to the ground at his side. The lack of pressure on his chest was welcome, but even as he leaned up, he could tell that trying to get up and jump would be foolish. His hip was burning due to the impact, and as he simply touched his hip, he knew he'd have to sit for a while. Maybe for the night. "Are you all right?" the boy asked. All Might looked at him again and saw a kid with concerned green eyes. All Might opened his mouth to say something, but he stopped himself. Few knew of his current condition, and despite facing monsters, the mere thought of revealing weakness to a child almost scared him. He was All Might. He protected children and was supposed to be a force of nature. But here he was in a pile of shattered nature and unable to stand. He didn't want to say anything to the boy, but as the kid moved the light to his hip, he realized he had no choice in the matter. "I apologize for nearly landing on you, young man. It seems I wasn't watching where I was going," All Might started. "No, it's all right," the boy said quickly, almost sounding guilty himself. "I was under a tree, and it's dark out." All Might's eyes caught the flicker of light beyond the boy, and about 30 feet away was a small campfire and his trail of destruction. The boy noticed his look and shined the light behind him, revealing several All Might-sized gouges in the dirt, and almost on cue, another flare of pain shot through his hip. "It seems I've caused quite a mess," All Might said with a shake of his head and a strained tone. "Is this your parents' land, my boy?" The boy seemed to freeze at that, and he slowly turned around with a nervous look on his face as he looked away. "Not exactly." All Might nearly laughed at the boy's nervousness. He had nearly landed on a little delinquent trespasser, and while he could technically do something about it, he was always partial to children. He couldn't do much at the moment anyway. "No worries, young man, I'm the one causing all the damage anyway," All Might said with a humorous tone as he pointed at himself with a thumbs up. The boy looked relieved for a moment, but his eyes and light quickly returned to All Might's hip. An inquisitive and worried look back on his face. All Might used the light to get a clear look at his hip, and despite a few large splinters of wood stuck in his uniform, there seemed to be no outward damage. "Are you all right, All Might?" Brushing away the splinters, All Might bit the bullet. "What's your name, young man?" The boy didn't respond at first, but as All Might looked back up at him he responded with a strained look on his face. "Kohei Horikoshi," he said quickly. "Well, young Kohei, as you can see, I am not." The night was supposed to be like any other in the countryside. Quiet, empty, and peaceful. He came out here for self-improvement, to both relax and work, but now that had been turned on its head completely. Looking to his left, he watched a man devour his leftover soup in front of the fire. This man wasn't just anyone, though. He was All Might. He used to idolize the man with everything in his body, but to see him just sitting there. He didn't know whether he should feel terrified, angry, or relieved. Or to try and sink into his hoodie. He figured he would have run into someone out here, but All Might. It was a 1 in a trillion chance he didn't even think of when he stepped foot out here. But there he was. Injured and slurping up his leftover soup that would have been dumped out. The hero's eyes were on the soup bowl in front of him, so All Might didn't notice him looking, but he almost looked ridiculous. The man was shrunk down to the size of a normal man, a secret skill of his apparently, and looked like he had a parachute wrapped around his body. Judging by his face and forearms, he was still rather built, and his hair seemed too big for his own head, but seeing him so small just seemed to defy everything he ever thought about the man. He wanted to ask a lot of questions about a lot of things, but as the two sat there in relative silence, his mind kept returning to one simple fact. All Might didn't know his face. All Might had come crashing out of the sky. He had explained that his hip was deteriorating, that he was getting older, and that he couldn't walk for a little while, but all he could think about was the fact that All Might didn't know his face. Anyone else would focus on the other things, and he did at first. But he didn't know his name was Midoriya Izuku. He didn't know about the arrest. His trial. Didn't know about his imprisonment. Izuku had become so used to heroes and random people noticing him in his life, but, his old hero. He just accepted his fake name. Izuku had to take a deep breath and center himself. Forcing himself to stay quiet and keep his swirling thoughts and feelings at bay. Why didn't he recognize his face? Why? Was he mocking him? Izuku was so used to people giving their opinions of him that he was almost waiting expectantly. But All Might didn't seem to recognize Izuku at all. One side of him wanted the hero to get it over with, to stop acting, but he didn't dare say anything. Izuku looked down at his hands between his legs, and he could see them shaking. Glancing up at the man, he seemed relaxed. At ease. Izuku wanted him to say something, but he feared what the hero would say if he did recognize him. The shake in the rest of his body was even more obvious. His fear becoming more and more palpable with every second he sat here. The clamminess of his hands. The phantom echo of a painful sting on his back. Izuku could almost feel. What makes you think you're ready to be a hero? A deep sense of nausea overcame him, and he stood up from his spot so suddenly that it startled All Might. Kohei. Gotta pee, Izuku mumbled quickly as he turned from the fire and quickly walked away. With every step, Izuku could feel his breath and stomach waver, and he lost track of how far away from the campfire he was as his vision spun like a carousel and brought him to the ground on his hands and knees. He could only hold it in for a moment, but the sudden coldness that spread through his body and past his shaking limbs broke him. The mushroom soup from only a little while ago burst from his throat like a dam had broken. He retched into the dirt. The feeling of wood chips beneath his hands only barely registered in his mind past the rancid smell. The weight in his stomach slowly subsided, and he couldn't stop the groan from escaping his throat as he braced for another disgusting discharge. Kohei. Izuku barely noticed the voice as his limbs pulsed in an old phantom pain. His stomach emptied again in a disgusting gurgle of noise as he didn't even attempt to try and puke quietly. Izuku wanted to curl up in a ball right there, to hide, but he didn't want to roll around in his own bile in the dirt. Are you alright, Kohei? The voice was closer, too close. Izuku glanced to his left, spit and bile dripping from his lips, and he immediately noticed the legs of All Might. One leg was held up slightly above the ground. Groaning again, Izuku tried to force up any remaining bile, but after a minute or so, his stomach seemed mostly settled. Izuku slowly leaned back up to sit on his knees, and he immediately felt All Might's hand on his back. The offending hand providing a slight amount of much-needed stability. Are you sick? All Might asked, the concern heavy in his voice. Izuku swirled the foul-tasting spit around in his mouth and spat it out in front of him. He did it a few more times to get some more of it out, but it was obvious he'd need some water for that. Kohei, if you're sick, I can't just leave you out here on your own. A deep-seated nausea hit him briefly, and he instinctively leaned into the hand, not sick. You look like you're about to faint, All Might said plainly. It's just a reaction, Izuku said without thinking. A reaction, the alarm in his voice clear, DMN my hip, I need to call an ambulance. It's not that kind of reaction, All Might, Izuku said as firmly as he could and grabbed the retreating hand. Izuku's vision was still a little wonky, but when he finally looked up at All Might, he saw a face that he'd seen on his mother dozens of times. However, this time it stung. It wasn't his mother or some doctor who was paid to care. No, it was All Might. He looked at Izuku with clear doubt, and after a moment, Izuku simply sighed as he let go of his hand. All Might made a tentative step back toward the camp, but Izuku pushed himself up to his feet before he could get far. His nervousness grew by the second, and Izuku hoped he wouldn't have to reveal much, but he didn't need All Might calling for help. He lied about his name to the man, and it took Emily a long time to convince his mother to let him come out here by himself. He needed to be able to go out on his own without summoning heroes and police. Nor did he need an official record of his activities outside of Humorize. It's a psychological response, All Might, Izuku said quietly. All Might stopped in his tracks, but Izuku didn't feel he could turn around and look at him at the moment. Psychological. Izuku sucked in a hard breath and tried to think of something simple to say. But the memories assaulted his mind, and he could feel the tears threatening to burst out at the mere thought of any of it. I went through some stuff a few years ago, and, Izuku sucked in a final shaky breath and pushed those tears down, whenever I see you in an ad, a video, a poster. There's a chance I just, well, you saw. All Might was quiet for a moment, general anxiety disorder. Yes and no, Izuku said thinly. Did I? He spoke, a grave and almost apologetic tone in the back of his voice. You didn't do anything, All Might, Izuku said quickly as he finally found the strength to turn around and face the man. His almost perfect face looked relieved, but his concern was even more prominent. He had the look he's seen on the man in every video and picture. The face of someone who wanted to help. The face of someone able. Izuku looked away from him with a still shaky breath and walked past him. No. He couldn't go to him. He had to do it himself. He went back to his spot and sat down in front of the fire. Rummaging through his bag for some water as All Might hobbled back to his spot. Wincing and truly looking like a man in pain. Izuku swirled some fresh water around his mouth, and he felt a little better now that the taste of bile was out of his mouth. All Might slowly lowered himself, and with a slight wince, he was back to sitting. However, he wasn't looking at the fire or his bowl of leftover soup anymore. Was it someone else? Izuku stilled at the question, and as All Might noticed that, a look of righteous fury sprouted on his features as he seemed ready to jump up again and serve justice. Did you report? It's been dealt with, All Might, Izuku said as confidently as he could, it's been years. All Might's eyes were locked on him like a hawk, and Izuku could tell he was searching for any scent of a lie. Izuku didn't look away, trying his best to weather that intense look and appear truthful to the hero. All Might's record on cases involving children were spotless and thorough, and nowadays he was teaching at Yui, but he didn't need or want that attentiveness now. Stemming his nervousness to the best of his ability, he smiled, and just a little. They got the guy, but now he looked towards the fire, dealing with the aftereffects. It's going to be a while before those go away. All Might stares for just a little longer, but the intensity slowly goes away as the fire crackles in front of the two. The glowing embers flying up above in the wind and extinguishing in the air. The hero let out a tired sigh before looking back at the fire himself. Izuku could tell he wanted to ask questions, to pry, but Izuku wouldn't tell him anything useful anyway. As long as it's dealt with, I guess, he said in a resigned tone, a hint of something else beneath it. The silence between them stayed for some time as the final speck of light in the sky went out. The only remaining light being the stars and the fire in front of him. All Might looked to be heavily in thought as he finished the rest of his soup, an almost impatient tap of his finger on the side of the wooden bowl being obvious in the quiet air around them. Izuku ignored the tap, but he refused to look back at the man. The veiled sense of nausea was ever present at the back of his mind despite his stomach being empty. Izuku debated it for a little while before he decided to pull out a journal and write down his log for the day. Specifically, leaving out All Might in case Eyes wanted to look through it. It would be easy to lie to them. Especially so if All Might doesn't pry. The trip was going well, all things considered, and he had walked maybe 12 miles today, but who knew how the night would go. Izuku eventually stuffed his journal back into his backpack before letting the whole thing fall onto its back. Izuku undid the straps on the bottom and pulled his sleeping bag loose. Looking down at his watch, he noticed the time was 10:27 p.m., and that All Might was still here. "Do you need to stay the night?" Izuku asked into the air. Izuku listened as All Might rotated one of his legs and winced. "Usually, these flashes of pain pass quickly, but I think that tree had other ideas," All Might spoke with discomfort. "You can stay if you need to, All Might. I'm not leaving till sunrise." "I don't wish to cause you discomfort, Kohei." Izuku would have laughed if he wasn't so perceptive, me. "I've seen villains cry at the sight of me, run in terror. But never have I seen a child react like you have at the sight of me," All Might spoke with a tone that almost sounded like regret. "I said it wasn't something you did, All Might," Izuku said lightly. "Maybe not, but to think some villain has distorted my mere image into something so frightening to you makes my blood boil," All Might said in a light tone of his own. The sound of righteous fury was just beneath that lightness, and its intensity was almost disorientating. Izuku finally looked at the man again, and All Might was staring at the fire. The shadows illuminate half of his face and left the other in shadow. The anger on his brow was as clear as the summer sun. "I sought to be a symbol to save people, to provide them hope, and to think someone, somehow, corrupted it for you. You still are All Might," Izuku said softly, "despite what they did." All Might's eyes snapped up and met Izuku's again, and what he saw was a man who deeply wanted to pry. A man with the power to do so if he really wanted to. A man who was just that, a man, under all that power. "Why did you become a hero?" Izuku watched the man remain silent for what felt like too long, but soon enough, a kind smile graced his features. "Well, because the world needed help." Chapter 5, Ready. Set. Start. The rain was pouring, and the clouds were roaring, but life must go on. The pitter-patter of busy Tokyo streets and alleys, as well as the honks of traffic, could leave one feeling discombobulated if they didn't know their way around. There were many things a man could do in this city, and with heroes around every corner, it was more than secure from random and pointless outbursts of violence. To Izuku, however, everything just made his work so much more difficult. Quiet. The type of quiet only found in places with no crises and villain attacks, and it was the enemy of everything he plans to do. Especially tonight. This was supposed to be his last assignment from Eyes. The last thing they needed from him in exchange for their education and training, and they said it was supposed to be a run-of-the-mill snatch and grab. It was something they've had him do a few times over the last year to test his skills and abilities, but this was in a whole different ballpark. Not even the last 2 months of in-the-field training were as nerve-wracking as this. They said that she was just a girl around his age, Melissa Shields, a young inventor and daughter of the famous David Shields. That she possessed information needed for the production of something Eyes was cooking up. Fleck tried downplaying it in the call, but the look in his eyes told Izuku everything he needed to know. That, despite the risks, they needed what she would have with her. Badly. She was quirkless. An American, blonde, blue-eyed, and here in Japan for a closed-door tech summit. But most important of all, untrained. On the surface, everything about that screamed an easy mark, but that wasn't the problem. No. That was far from the problem. Her father and who he was friends with was the problem. Izuku has been training under the watchful eyes of Eyes for a year now, being educated by them for even longer. They were intense, insistent, and capable of great violence if need be. A violence he's seen aimed at him only once by Flecht himself. But to be in All Might's orbit, oppositionally, even just a little bit, had him almost jumping at every crack of thunder in the storming clouds above. Like the aging titan he had met by chance in the countryside only 2 months ago was some omnipresent god that could somehow sense where he was and what he was about to do. It may just be the rain, but he could almost feel the nervous sweat on his skin underneath the black RBB rain suit. Shaking his head, he tried to keep his mind on the time, but every few seconds, the what-ifs returned. A tremor in his hands threatened to spread to his whole body if he didn't grip them tightly, and as he watched the drops of water drip down from his hood in front of his eyes caught glimpses of the girl between the curtains of the second-story window across the street. The summit Melissa is attending is about future advancement, and all presenters were bringing a variety of in-depth, to be developed, but greenlit, product blueprints to present and collaborate on. The first day of the summit had come and gone, and now she was supposed to be sleeping and getting her rest for day 2. The keyword being supposed to, since the lights from between the curtains of many rooms were still on, including Melissa's bedroom. Originally, it was supposed to be David Shields himself who was coming to this summit. But an emergency had occurred on Island, something about a crack in the city's hull, and Melissa had come in her father's stead. All the information that she had with her, the info that Hummer Eyes wanted, was on a laptop that she kept with her at all times. There were only 2 realistic options to retrieve the laptop. 1, while in transit to the conference, or 2, to grab it from where she's staying. Grabbing the laptop in transit wasn't in Izuku's bag of tricks when it was just him alone, so that left him with only one viable option, and that's where the current problem resided. She wasn't staying in a hotel. She wasn't staying near the conference in the urban jungle. She was instead staying in a rental house in a suburban area on the outskirts of Tokyo. If it were just a hotel or an apartment, he could rely on relaxed and standard security, but even a cursory glance at the place revealed every trick in the modern-day book. Infrared cameras, motion sensors, alarms, motion-activated lights, and a few other little things. Sure, he could just ignore some of it, but this was Melissa Shield. If her father didn't care about his little girl, he wouldn't have gotten a place without all the bells and whistles. Izuku couldn't afford to be seen. Nor could he afford to have All Might taking a personal interest in him if any evidence was unknowingly left behind. Izuku rolled his finger over the wireless trigger in his pocket. The almost weightless little device felt heavy in his pocket, but he shut that weight out of his mind for a moment. He only had one option to knock out security, avoid detection, and have it all be unnoticed until it was too late. It would be loud, even with the storm, but it was all he could do. Taking a deep breath, he flipped off the trigger's safety cover. The weight of the trigger only grew, and Izuku realized why as he placed his thumb on the SWCH. This would be the start. Everything he's done and everything he's worked for would finally be put in play. There would be no going back, and if he was caught, it would all be over for some time. Maybe even for good. He watched a light in a different room on the second story of Melissa's house SWCH off. He heard the rustling of plastic bins down the street. A whisper of wind through the street strummed the chord of nervous tension in Izuku's core. A tension that would destroy his resolve if he let it. A light timer went off on his wrist. 1:37 a.m. Izuku's hand stiffened, the last of his doubt showing, but with a final roll of his shoulders, he put that doubt to rest. He flipped the SWCH. There ain't no rest for the wicked. The blast was almost immediate, and for a brief moment, the sky in the distance was bright and blue. The blast, reminiscent of a distant sparkling firework, hit his ears in a burst of noise that wasn't too loud or quiet. Izuku could hear the faint sound of car alarms going off in the distance, followed shortly by the sound of sirens that got his BLD and adrenaline pumping. Izuku waited, and he watched with a smile beneath his balaclava as the street lights flickered and died. The rest of the lights inside Melissa's house and a few of the other houses on the street that had outside lights on went dark. Izuku bolted across the street from his hovel and quickly jumped over the wooden fence. He stayed low, avoiding windows, and arrived at his entry point. The first-floor bathroom window was thankfully clear, and as he cautiously peeked through, he saw nothing but a dark, empty room. He strained his ears for a sound past all the rain, and to his dismay heard the faint sound of Melissa talking. Izuku moved to open his set of tools, but after testing the window, he was surprised to find that it was unlocked. He carefully cracked it open, the window's tracks not making a sound, and he strained his ears again. "Are you kidding me? I was just talking with Dad." Her voice, muffled through the walls of the house, quickly faded, and if he was guessing correctly, she was likely upstairs still. Izuku opened the window the rest of the way and entered. Staying on the ball of his feet and keeping his body low. Ready to jump or lie flat at a moment's notice. It was just a simple break-in, but even now it was nerve-wracking. Every creak. Every thump. The sounds of the house and the heavy pitter-patter of rain behind him all sounded louder than they actually were. The darkness did nothing to quell his racing heart, and Izuku silently prayed to any god that would listen to him for an eventless evening. So much depended on tonight. He heard footsteps above his head, and Izuku cautiously stalked forward. Carefully opening the bathroom door and moving down a short hallway, he quickly found himself in the kitchen. There wasn't much to see in the bare-bones kitchen, given that the place was a rental, but Izuku quickly spotted the laptop case hanging on the back of a chair. He heard the footsteps above again, and he quickly went forward and searched the bag. There were plenty of flash drives, and Izuku quickly pocketed them into his fanny pack at his waist, but there was no sign of the laptop. "Can't this stupid thing work? I tested this thing before I left," he heard Melissa say above with frustration. Her voice echoed through the house down to him, and Izuku simply pulled out a small throwing knife. Izuku stalked towards the stairs. Cursing internally, but resigned to the fact that the easy way out wasn't an option. The knife was coated in a fast-acting neurotoxin that would paralyze her in under 20 seconds. A special blend of herbs and spices created by Hummerais that could keep someone still for 24 hours, or 2 weeks. Depending on the person. The floorboards were silent under his feet, and as he took one slow step up the stairs at a time, the pounding of rain on the roof and the crack and boom of thunder and lightning became more apparent. Briefly, Izuku thought of Melissa's perspective and wondered how scared she would be if she knew someone was getting closer to her. A tantalizing mental image that he thought would look good in film. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark, and as Izuku put his weight on his first step, a loud creak echoed through the hall. Izuku nearly recoiled back down the stairs instinctively, but at the same time, Melissa let out a loud yell of triumph. "Heck yeah! Take that weather!" Izuku, now stiff and holding his breath, his heartbeat ringing in his ears, waited at the top of the stairs as he listened to her footsteps. She was moving around the room. Going through what sounded like bags, and humming a little tune as she did it. She sounded like she didn't have a care in the world outside that little room of hers. Still not noticing a thing. Slowly sliding his foot forward, he tested the wood with a little pressure, and was relieved that the next few floorboards didn't squeak under pressure. Izuku mounted the last step, and at the end of the hall was a slightly cracked open door. There wasn't a lot of light showing through the crack, maybe a portable lamp's worth, and he saw the light flicker as she walked by the door. "I just need to get the satellite connection up and," he heard her mumble to no one. Izuku took one step forward after another, his nerves decreasing as he heard her plop down onto a rolling chair. The sound of tapping keyboard keys reached his ears and synced with his heartbeat like a cosmic joke. Izuku stopped a few feet from the door. His eye slowly peeked through the crack at the lone girl in the bedroom. He'd only been able to peek at her from across the road, but up close like this, she did look appealing. The light from the laptop he needed, illuminated her skin and hair nicely. Accompanied by the fact she was quirkless, and it almost made a sense of guilt spring up in his gut. But he quickly squashed that feeling as he put his left hand on the door and raised his right arm. He couldn't afford to back out now. He flexed his fingers holding the knife. exhaling a slow breath as he rolled his shoulders ever so carefully in the dark hallway. And there we go. In an instant, Izuku pulled the door open. The hinges creaked loudly as he flung his blade towards the pretty girl's arm. In that split second, he saw her look towards him. Her eyes widened in terror, accompanied by the beginning of a terrified scream, as a knife embedded into her right arm. "Ack!" she screamed out as she recoiled to her side. She recoiled hard enough to fall out of her chair and sprawled out onto the ground. Her hand was on her bloody arm in an instant as she sputtered and pushed herself back on the floor. Grabbing the knife, she hastily pulled it out. The blood now flowing cleanly and staining her clothes and the floor. "Stay back!" she screamed out, the strain of abject panic in her voice. Izuku simply walked forward. She pushed herself into the wall of the room behind her, but he stopped a few feet away from her. However, in her state of panic, she didn't seem to notice. "Stop," she said slowly, her whole frame starting to simultaneously shake and slacken. Looking down at the terrified and shaking girl with as much resolve as he could, he stayed quiet. Not trusting himself to say anything to the girl. "What, did you?" Izuku watched her heavy and drugged eyes slowly close. The whole of her body staying up for but a moment, the last of her strength, before going limp and unceremoniously collapsing to her side. Her injured arm was now pressed against the wooden floorboards, and the blood started pooling around her arm and upper body. Izuku took a step or two closer and kneeled in front of her. Being careful not to step in the pool, he moved her body just enough to expose her arm and internally cursed at what he saw. The wound wasn't terrible, but he had hit a vein or something crucial beneath. She was losing too much, and by the time anyone would think to check in on her, she'd be long gone. Definitely by morning. Izuku let go of her arm and let her flop forward. He started to get up, but as he looked at her face again, a pang of guilt hit him. Her eyes taught him not to care for targets beyond the mission. That caring led to mistakes, and mistakes meant getting caught and going back to a cage. A cold shiver went down his back, and his hands shook lightly down by his leg. Her eyes was right about a lot of things, but seeing this quirkless girl almost dying in front of him was almost too much. He should leave her, regardless of who she was related to. But as he let out a sigh of resignation, as his legs refused to simply get up and leave, he knew he couldn't. Reaching back towards the chair, he pulls a puffy sweater off its back. It wasn't too thick, but not that thick either. Reaching down towards Melissa's waist, he unbuckles her belt and pulls it loose. Not blind to the visual, but simply ignoring it for now. Izuku pulled her forward and laid her on her back, quickly positioning the belt at the top of her arm and tightening it at the top. Not too tight, but enough. He then uses her coat to clean up her arm the best he could. He had no antiseptic, to his surprise, so this would have to do for her. Izuku observed the dark wound with distaste, but he quickly looked towards the bed and stood up and walked over to it. Ripping off the sheets and returning to wrap them thickly around her wound. Careful to pull her halfway out of the small pool of blood on the ground so it wouldn't completely soil the makeshift bandage. Izuku looked over his work one final time before letting out a stress-filled sigh. The only sound in the room was both of their heavy breathing, the rain on the roof, and the sound of thunder above. The only light, a small wireless lamp still lit, cast the room in an orangish-yellow glow that emphasized the scene in front of him and the blood on his hands. Izuku had long accepted that this life would be bloody. Hell, that was the whole point. But this girl. She was like him. Quirkless. Worthless. She'd done nothing to him, and he hoped this made up for it, even just a little. "Melissa. You there?" Izuku stiffened for but a moment before he spun around with another blade in his hand. Ready to slash. Ready to run. But the room was still empty. The door was as he left it, and the windows and drapes were still closed. "I see you got hit by a bad storm. I hope the satellite connection wasn't too much hassle," the male voice spoke. Sounding older, concerned. Izuku's eyes darted to the laptop. His true target. Melissa. Can you hear me? Izuku's eyes widened as he recognized that voice. David Shields. Her father. Izuku looked back at the girl, and her steady breath was the only thing that calmed his nerves. The makeshift tourniquet and bandages were doing their job, but he could still see the beginnings of them darkening. She'd need professional attention. Soon. Izuku unslung his special backpack and quietly walked around the computer. What he was about to do was risky, and as he parted the curtain, he saw the result of his work miles away through the thick rain. The telephone pole transformer was still sparking dangerously, and the police lights were all around below it. Distracted. For now. Melissa. Maybe I should call back here, the sound of tapping keys on the other side coming out of the speakers. Izuku took a deep breath and unzipped the backpack. He roughly dropped the bag behind the laptop and positioned the opening behind it. Melissa. If you need to go to bed, just let me dash. The voice cut off as Izuku slowly and deliberately turned the laptop in the direction of his clump of a daughter. Though the camera was still aimed too high for him to see her on the floor. Izuku looked down at his bloody and dirty gloved hand. Thinking over his escape for one more moment. Melissa, I have work dash. Izuku could hear David's breath immediately hitch as Izuku purposely moved his bloody hand in front of the camera to then reach down and grab the front of the laptop. Then using his other hand, Izuku pushed the top laptop forward and aimed the camera squarely at his daughter. Melissa. Oh my god, his panic was immediate, and Izuku could hear a scramble on the other side. What did you do to my dash? Izuku slammed the laptop shut and easily slid it into his backpack. Zipping it up easily and cutting off any signals the device could receive or send out. Izuku slung the device over his shoulders, his eyes drawn to the appealing and injured Melissa one last time. A particularly loud burst of thunder echoed outside and slightly shook the house and his own nerves. Izuku ran. The rain pelted him as he burst out the front door and onto an empty suburban street. Disappearing into side streets and alleys along a safe route. Avoiding cars and people. Keeping his eyes open for anything as he got miles and miles away from the scene of the crime. The rain thoroughly washing him of blood along the way. Though on his way, when Izuku looked up into the air between buildings as he caught his breath, in a flash of lightning, Izuku swore he saw a large man flying through the air back the way he came.